Good morning, High Rock Church. It's such an honor for me to be able to share God's Word with you this morning, as well as to join in this incredible sermon series, 7 Things You Didn't Know About God. I'm really excited to share this morning from the text that we just heard read, because it's a powerful text, and in fact, its placement in the Gospel of John is quite interesting. Scholars have noted that its placement at the very beginning of this book draws one's attention because in these moments, Jesus doesn't give any teaching. He doesn't explain anything. We just see him in action. And we have to kind of decipher and extrapolate, who is this Jesus? What do these 2 moments speak about his character? And if we do that, in essence, the rest of the book becomes quite more accessible. In other words, the placement of these 2 events, Jesus at a wedding, Jesus at a temple, and what he does there at the beginning of this book is intentional, because what the gospel writer John is essentially saying is, if you understand Jesus in these moments, you have a chance of understanding him throughout the rest of this book in a very accurate manner. And while we begin here, I want to draw your attention to something that's quite striking that really gripped me, and I dare to say, if we take some time, it might strike you the same way. In this moment, the first instance we see Jesus in this chapter is at a wedding. Now, if you and I were to take a random poll of strangers that we would meet, or even family members and friends that maybe are not religious, and you ask them point blank the question, where do I find God? Where can I go to encounter God? The answers would be varied, but quite more than likely, many of them would say, you should probably go to a holy site. You should probably go to a church, or to a mosque. You should go to a religious place. That's where you would find God. Yet the gospel writer John invites us to find Jesus not at a holy site, not at a religious activity, but at a wedding. And at this moment, we see Jesus at a wedding. And I would argue there's probably no better place to see Jesus in action for us to understand who he is, and in particular in this series, for us to be surprised as to who he is, perhaps to wrestle with some things that we didn't quite naturally associate with Jesus. A wedding affords us this opportunity for us to look into his character and see him as he truly is. And at this wedding, Jesus does some things that we're going to unpack in a moment. But before we do so, in full disclosure, I actually don't like weddings. I know that's a really weird thing to say as a minister or someone who has officiated more weddings than I can count. In particular, one big surprise during this COVID season, I officiated more weddings during COVID than I did probably in the previous 2 years. It was a madhouse. Everybody that wanted to get married was getting married, and marriages and ceremonies, all safe, socially distanced, some virtual, some in person in backyards, really small events, etc. Many weddings. And I've been invited not just to officiate, I've been invited as guest, and not too crazy about them. Why, you may ask? Here's the honest truth. I don't dance. And that may not be a big deal to some of you, but I'm Latino, I'm Puerto Rican. It is apparently an unspoken, and if you're around my relatives, a very outspoken assumption I should be able to dance. Compounded with that reality is that my wife is Irish, and she's an incredible dancer. In fact, she dances better to my people's music than I do. And so I've never really enjoyed weddings for that moment. But what I do enjoy is the moment when a couple is standing face to face and they're declaring their love and their commitment to each other. Why I enjoy that moment is because it speaks to a core longing that's inside of all of us, a desire that's in every human heart, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not. If we search deep within, we'll find in each of us a desire for a love that's greater than ourselves, for a commitment that we can make to one another that actually pushes us beyond ourselves. We crave for an eternal kind of love, a love that will outlive us, a love that will be sacrificial. We want to be fully known and fully loved. And that's what brings people to the altar at a wedding. Over the years, I've been amazed to find drug dealers get married, mobsters get married, people who destroy human life on an everyday basis find themselves at altars. Why? Because again, we were created by God with this longing to search for love that's eternal, that's bigger than us, ultimately driving us to find that love in Him, but we also seek it out in covenantal marriage. Jesus is at this wedding, and I need to point out something that may be obvious, but it may not be, but I think it's actually quite revolutionary for us to realize, and it speaks to the essence of this sermon series. Jesus was invited to this wedding, not to officiate, not to say a prayer over the meal, not to do anything religious. He was invited simply because for this couple, He epitomized joy. They couldn't imagine their special day without His presence. Could you imagine what that says about Jesus and how strikingly different that is than many people's conceptions of Jesus? For most people, especially those that don't follow Jesus, Jesus would be the last person, or someone like Jesus would be the last person that they would ever consider to invite to their wedding. Yet for this couple, they could not imagine the most significant day of their life without Jesus' presence there. Why is that something that we should take note of, especially in light of the sermon series? Something that you may not have known about God that I want to focus our time today, this morning, part of our time, is this. Jesus was the life of the party. In fact, if you look through the Gospels, one of the places that you could find Him most often when He wasn't teaching, when He wasn't performing miracles, the place where you could find Him most often was around a dinner table. And He was there having meals with people and drinking and bringing life and laughter, so much so that one of the accusations that they brought up against Jesus was that He was a drunkard and a glutton. Now, He clearly was not those things. He didn't enjoy these pleasures in excess to the point of being reckless. He wasn't sinful in the way that He enjoyed these pleasures. Yet, however, He did enjoy them enough that when they brought out this accusation, it stuck, it landed, because there was enough evidence. Everywhere they looked and turned, they saw Him at dinner tables, bringing joy, bringing life. And in particular, at these tables, He would bring people that were on the margins of society. People that nobody wanted to have dinner with, whether it was tax collectors or prostitutes or people that were looked down upon, especially by the religious elite of that time. For Jesus, those were the people around His dinner table. Because every time Jesus was at a moment of celebration, He was in essence modeling to us the world that He desired to create. The world that was infused with His resurrection life. A world without divisions, a world without separation, a world where everyone was welcomed at His table. Not the world as it existed, with class and division and strife, but the world as He was seeking to create. And at this moment, He's at this wedding, bringing joy to this couple. And He was invited because that's who He was. But we read, it isn't all joyful, because actually something changes quite rapidly in this wedding. What we come to find out is that there was a crisis at this wedding. Now, it would do us well to kind of pull out this context a little bit more to understand that in this culture, weddings were most often a multi-day event. It wasn't just one day. It wasn't just one meal, one big father-daughter dance. No, it was a multi-day celebration. And in addition to it being a multi-day celebration, it was also the social event of the year, quite often for that town or that location. This was a huge moment where Jesus was invited to come and to attend, and something has gone horrifically wrong. We read that Jesus' mother comes to Him and communicates the crisis to Him. It says they've run out of wine. And she begins to ask Him, do something. Now, for us, in our time, this moment may not register the way it would have if we would have been there at that moment. Because, okay, you run out of wine, then you just tell people, hey, there's no more wine, soda for the rest of the night, or just have some water. You've drank enough. But no, in this culture, to run out of wine at this moment, the social event of the year, would communicate to your guest a huge disrespect. And it wasn't just a temporary disrespect. This isn't just something that would happen now and then just kind of go away and be forgotten. No, in this culture, it was a shame-based culture. And in that culture, mistakes, missteps, social faux pas, they didn't just come and go and people just forgot about it. No, in a shame-based culture, you experience bad moments like this very differently than you and I experienced them in a guilt-based culture. Growing up in Western civilization, Western society, we are more accustomed to a guilt-based culture, which is very different than a shame-based culture. See, in a guilt-based culture, the message we receive constantly is, what you have done is wrong. But in a shame-based culture, when you do wrong, the message you hear is, who you are is wrong. It's a label that's attached to your person, your being, that you carry for the rest of your life. Every situation you find yourself in after the shameful moment, you are known by the worst thing that you have ever done. You never can escape it. It's a label you carry. And so at this moment, this couple has ran out of wine, and Mary, Jesus' mother, is imploring Jesus to do something because Mary knew all too well what a shame-based culture could do to a person. Because if you recall, when she was found with child through the Holy Spirit and Joseph, her husband, found out that she was pregnant, not with a child of his own, he was going to divorce her secretly because he knew what she was going to go through socially. She could potentially be stoned because of this act. She could be killed for sure in a shameful moment where the actions that she had done, society would just hurl on her the worst kind of punishment, especially as a woman. She knew firsthand the threat of shame and what it could potentially do to one's life. And so she comes to Jesus imploring him to do something. And do something he does. But what he does and how he does it is absolutely stunning. Because in essence, when she began to ask Jesus to do something about the wine, what she was really saying to Jesus was, deliver this couple from shame. Don't let them taste shame. Don't let them carry this label. Do something. Intervene. Don't let them live the rest of their life under the shadow of this shameful moment. She's crying out for their deliverance. Help these people to avoid this shame. To which Jesus responds, says, woman, my hour has not yet come. On the surface, you might find that response like, was that disrespectful? He's referring to his mother as woman. Actually, it was a gesture of respect to refer to her in that way. But what he says is interesting because he says, my hour has not yet come. It's a weird response to, hey, help this couple. They've ran out of wine. Do something so they don't experience shame. Jesus says, my hour has not yet come. What does he mean by that? What he's trying to communicate at that moment is, my hour to rid the world of shame has not yet come. The moment that I came into this earth for, to carry the sin, the shame, the brokenness of all humanity on that brutal cross, that moment has not yet come. There's coming a moment where I'm going to rid the world of shame. He's pointing to that hour that is yet to come. Yet at this moment, his mother's saying, but what about now? Can you give us a foretaste, in essence, of what's to come? Can you do for this couple on a smaller scale what you're going to do eternally for the whole world? And at this moment, Jesus steps in and he gives us a taste of who he is. We get to see our God, who's the life of the party, in full display. And we see Jesus embodying the fact that he is the fullness of grace. We read that he steps into this moment and Mary tells the servants, do whatever he tells you to do, which, by the way, is not in my notes, but man, is that the best slogan, mantra for us as followers of Jesus. How different would our lives would be in 2021 and onward if we just do whatever he says. But she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And immediately Jesus tells these servants to go and fill these 6 stone water jars. These jars were empty and they were quite massive. They held up to 30 gallons apiece. And he tells the servants to fill them to the brim with water. Now, this was not a small endeavor. There weren't faucets or hoses. They're walking back and forth from some type of body of water, filling these things multiple times to get to the brim. And now they're filled with capacity. And at this moment, Jesus turns water to wine. This is his first miracle. And what's interesting is that in his first miracle, we find Jesus repurposing religious jars that were used for cleansing and for purification. He repurposes them as vessels for his miraculous intervention. At that moment, Jesus is saying something so profound. He's communicating that on so many levels, our religious endeavors and attempts to be found cleansed and pleasing to God are very similar to these empty jars. We're empty. We're dry. Our efforts at the end of the day leave us thirsty. They don't quench our ultimate longing. Yet Jesus steps in and shows what religion can't do, what your efforts and mine are powerless to do, my grace can do. And he steps in and he does a miracle that saves this couple from absolute shame. See, at this moment, you may not have known this about Jesus, but it's important to note our God is the life of the party, but he's not just the social life of the party. He takes joy to another level. He rescues us from shame and from despair, things that seek to detract our life and our joy. And he restores our lives to the core. See, because of what Jesus did, this earthly couple would live free from the shame that this moment could have caused. And it's the same for us in that because of what Jesus has done on the cross, we can live from the shame of our mistakes, the things that we've done and things that have been done to us. How powerful it is to walk this life and to know that I am not the worst things I've done or the worst things that have been done to me. That's not my identity. That's not who I am. Who I am is who Jesus says I am. And he covers us in his grace. He intervenes. He steps in where we're weak, where we're dry, where we're insufficient. His miraculous power transforms us. See, at this moment, I want to invite us to just pause for a second. And here's what I want to invite us to do. We're going to put up a few questions on the screen and want to encourage you to just take a few moments, whether alone or with people that you're watching, and just spend some time processing these questions with God. As they come up, if you need extra time, feel free to pause the screen, and then you can come back when you're done. But don't rush through this moment if you begin to connect with God as these questions emerge. Welcome back. And before we transition and explore Jesus at a different moment, in a different place, at a temple, I think it's appropriate to pause and wrap our hearts around this reality that our God is the life of the party. And as the life of the party, he redeems, he brings joy, he rescues and delivers us from shame. He brings us into full life. And why I think it's important to pause there is because for many of us, if we search our hearts, our history, we don't often meet with God in spaces of joy. In fact, joy and pleasure typically exist over here, and God is experienced over here, normally around sadness, around difficulty, around despair, and tough times. But if we glean anything from Jesus at this wedding, is that God desires us to encounter him in the joyous moments of life. For us to not separate our capacity to experience joy from the creator of joy. That for so long, we experience joy disconnected from God. And so what happens when that's the case? We continue to seek out joy and pleasure and delight, separate, distant, disconnected from God. And here God is all along saying, I actually want to meet you there in those spaces. I create those moments because I love you. And I want you to encounter me there in those moments. What would it look like for you and I to encounter God during a hike? To encounter God during a good conversation with a friend or a spouse or our children? To encounter God looking at a wonderful piece of art or during a great meal or celebration, a graduation, the birth of a child? Moments that we experience joy, but not just experience joy for the sake of it, or experiencing joy separate from God, but to pause at those moments and recognize the presence of God. Wherever there's joy, where there's true delight, Jesus is there, and he wants to bring that joy to another level. If our God is the life of the party, and perhaps for some of us, we're still wrestling with that idea that's not comfortable, that's not first nature for us. It kind of disarms us, it disorients us. We don't naturally see God as the life of the party, as a bringer of joy, as someone that we should be connecting with in joyous moments. For those of us that struggle with that, this moment in John invites us to truly encounter Jesus in those moments, to not separate our pursuit of joy and pleasure from the creator of joy and pleasure, to recognize Jesus wants to meet us there, not just in moments of despair, sadness, or difficulty. What would that look like for you? I want to invite you this week that perhaps walk around with a journal or some capacity to kind of note and to pause. When you experience joy, pause, reflect, recognize the presence of God at those moments, connect with Jesus, and begin to slowly but surely reorient your capacity to experience joy with the very giver and creator of it. But this passage, John chapter 2, doesn't just present us with this image of Jesus as the life of the party, and that can be a lot for us to process, but actually transitions us to Jesus at a temple. And it's at the temple that we actually walk away with perhaps the biggest shock. Because on some levels, it would have been very natural for us to assume that Jesus would have behaved at the wedding the way he did at the temple. See, we read at the temple when he arrives, he begins to flip tables. One gospel account says that he fashioned a whip and began to drive people out of the temple, not just any people, the money changers. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Jesus is just transforming the temple, cleansing it, just upheaval. The moment he comes in, he's just cleaning house. We would expect him to do that at a wedding, perhaps, and responding to just too much drinking, too much dancing, too much recklessness, etc. But yet, at the wedding, he brings nothing but joy. And in fact, not only does he bring joy in life, he brings deliverance from shame. But at the temple, Jesus does something vastly different. And we have to understand what was happening at the temple for us to understand what was the different thing that Jesus did. See, this could not be a bigger contrast from the wedding. When we enter into the temple, we find Jesus possessed with holy anger, a righteous indignation, because he sees something in the temple that's quite disturbing for him, to say the least. I think at this moment it challenges our image of God, because for most of us, our image of God is one where God is nothing but loving. We can't imagine God being angry or having the reaction that Jesus is having at the temple. But yet, the reality is that if you and I disproportionately see God as a loving God and don't have room to see him as a God who also gets angry, we actually are limiting our capacity to experience his fullness of love, because love cannot exist without anger. I know it's a bit disorienting, but the truth is, if you and I love someone or something and we see an injustice happening to the person that we love and we don't feel anger, then there's something disconnected in us. See, when you love something, when you love someone, and you see something happening to that person or thing that degrades them, it infuriates us. We rise to the occasion. We want to stop what's happening because this is not how things should be. And at this moment, Jesus is angry because he enters into the temple, a place that was erected and dedicated for worship, and he finds some of the worst displays of injustice that you could ever imagine. We read that when Jesus comes, he begins to clean out the temple from the money changers. And he turns their tables over and drives them out of the temple. And in the Gospels, it says that Jesus is saying at this moment, my house should be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. And so what was happening at this moment is that when Jesus encounters these money changers were doing something that on the surface and their first original intent was actually quite good. The motivation. See, these money changers, why they even existed at the temple was because as worshipers would come to Jerusalem, they would come with Roman currency. And on Roman currency was an image of Caesar. And that image carried the weight of a godlike worship. See, Caesar was viewed as a god. And so for these worshiping Jews, they had a conflict in their conscience when they would receive money in the temple that had this inscription of a false god, Caesar. So what did they do? They created their own temple currency so that when worshipers would come, they would bring their idol-laden Roman currency, exchange it for temple currency, and now they weren't bringing a piece of idolatry into the temple. Great motive. I can understand why they did it. However, it became a source of huge injustice. Because what happened is that these money changers, over time, they began to exploit these worshipers with their unjust exchange rate. Best way I could explain this, and for parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, you're going to feel this pain point. Have you ever gone to Chuck E. Cheese? I personally think it's one of the worst places in the world. It's just filled with germs and kids going crazy and so overpriced. But I've gone there a number of times for birthdays and such. And what happens at Chuck E. Cheese? You bring your good money and they make you exchange it for their Chuck E. Cheese money. And you are being so exploited. $1 is not worth $1 at Chuck E. Cheese. They give you the pittance in exchange. Then you walk out and you think you're getting ahead when they give you these tickets. And so I can go on. And so I don't want to do that because I want to bring myself to a place of agitation. And I don't want to do that to any parents or grandparents. But you get the idea. People are being ripped off at the temple. But not just anybody's being ripped off. The poor are being ripped off. Because it's one thing if you have means and you're traveling to the temple and you're coming to worship and you have to exchange your money as you're trying to give an offering. and you have means, and yeah, you know that they're taking advantage of you. The exchange rate is not just, but if you have means, you can endure it. But imagine what a poor widow would experience when they want to give, and yet they're being exploited at the very temple. This was going on for a long time. But not only was this exploitation happening that was disproportionately impacting the poor, there was also another egregious, horrible thing that was taking place. The tables of these money changers were strategically placed at an area that was called the Court of the Gentiles. This area in the temple was the only place that non-Jews, Gentiles, could actually stand and witness worship. They weren't allowed to come into the temple because they were outsiders. They were considered unclean, but they were allowed to stand at this one location and be able to witness the throngs of people coming to sacrifice and worship and sing and pray and give offerings to God. Yet these money changers, on top of being corrupt and extorting the poor, they set up their tables in a place where it would exclude outsiders. They essentially were closing the door of faith. You realize that in the old covenant before Jesus, people could actually turn and become proselytized. They could turn in faith and follow the Jewish faith, even if they were born as Gentiles. This moment is so egregious. Jesus is walking into the poor being mistreated through this practice that was ingrained in the temple. This has been going on for a bit. And on top of that, anyone who's on the outside of the faith and would want to actually find out who these Jewish people are and their covenants and what is this all about and who's this Messiah? What does it look like to wait for this Messiah and to follow this path and this way? They have said no. It's an unjust practice and it's a cold-hearted act toward those who most desperately need the grace that's found in worship. To this, Jesus comes and he turns these tables upside down. And he begins to fashion a whip and drive people out that were practicing this corrupt work. And what we read afterwards is very interesting. Because we read after Jesus is demonstratively angry and flipping these tables, we read that the sick and the lame, those who were badly broken physically, came to Jesus after he did all this, that he would heal them. That's interesting because what it tells us is that the way he demonstrated his anger did not produce fear in them. They did not feel unsafe in his presence. Because potentially what they saw was someone doing what should have been done for a long time. They all would have recognized this is unjust. What this practice that we've just allowed to become part of our worship, this needs to be undone, but no one has done anything. And yet Jesus comes in and finally eradicates this corrupt system. And the poor, the vulnerable, the broken physically had a sense of relief. And they come to Jesus and he heals them. See, at this moment, what we see Jesus doing is so powerful and it's so contrary to what we see him doing at the wedding that I think it's important to pause. We're going to put up a discussion question just at this moment before we dive in any deeper. And this question is asking us to consider which aspect of Jesus's character do you relate to easier? Jesus at the wedding or Jesus at the temple? Take a moment and process this. Now, as I invited you to process which aspect of Jesus' character it's easier for you to connect with and access, is because they're two very different aspects of who he is. The Jesus at the wedding is a Jesus that any of us would want to hang out with. If you ask me on any given day, which aspect of Jesus would you want to be around the most? I'd say the wedding. That Jesus is fun. He brings life. He's creating water into wine. That is a fun Jesus. Jesus at the temple is intimidating. He's intense. He's not what most people would want to choose to do on their Saturday. Yet Jesus at the wedding and at the temple cannot be separated. If you and I want to experience this Jesus who is the life of the party, we also have to experience this Jesus who is the corrector of wrongs. You can't experience Jesus on one extreme without experiencing him at the other. We can't pick and choose. And if you and I want to experience Jesus who is the life of the party, we also have to experience Jesus at the temple, because what happens in both of these spaces is very different, yet it's the same Jesus. See, at the wedding, Jesus is bringing deliverance. But at the temple, Jesus is bringing discipline. And if you and I are going to walk with Jesus, we need both. We need Jesus to deliver us from our shame, from our inadequacies, from the things that have been done to us, the words that have been spoken over us, the traumatic situations that seek to imprison our life. We need Jesus to deliver us, but we also need Jesus to discipline us. We need Jesus to come into our life and look at ingrained practices, systems, patterns that have been there, perhaps even before we were born, and we just accept them as norm. And we need Jesus to come into our life and say, this is error. This does not conform to my way. We need Jesus to grab those things and upheaval, turn them upside down, drive these things out of our life. We need deliverance and discipline. But in my experience, and perhaps you can relate to this, how often we seek to separate those two. So on some levels, we'll say, Jesus, I do need you to deliver me. I need you to save me. Life is too much for me to carry. It's too heavy on my own. Save me, rescue me. I need your help. But don't tell me what to do. Help me, but don't tell me how to live. Don't tell me who to love. Don't tell me what to prioritize. I just need your deliverance. I didn't come looking for your discipline. But some of us are on the other extreme. We'll say, you know what? Actually, I do need the discipline of Jesus. I would love for him to align my life and get it in order and take me from the extremes of error and wasted time and untapped potential. Jesus fashioned my life so that I could live optimally and fully. Discipline my life. But I don't need to be rescued. I'm good. I can handle life on my own. You know, sin, shame, I'm good. I can carry that on my own. I don't need to be rescued. I'm not pitiful. I'm not weak. But I would love you as a life coach. I would love you as a self-help guru. But we can't have Jesus on one extreme without the other. The reality is we need both the deliverance of Jesus and the discipline of Jesus. And if you and I truly encountered Jesus, who's the life of the party, this shocking revelation that our God brings joy and laughter and fullness, he also is a God who brings correction and order and saves us from error and confronts injustice and establishes patterns and rhythms that dehumanize us and others. Jesus is after to uproot. He brings deliverance and discipline. With that, I want to invite you to reflect just for a moment before we end our time. I want to cue you up for this week for times of reflection and prayer as you ask these two big questions. What's your wedding and what's your temple? What I mean by those questions is the first one, what's your wedding? Similar to the wedding scene at this moment, what are the moments of joy, of life, of vibrancy that perhaps are experienced disconnected from God? Perhaps you only experience God during moments of sorrow and sadness and confession, and that's good, but that's so woefully incomplete because Jesus wants you and I to meet him in spaces of joy and life and vibrancy and connect the fact that he is the creator and giver of joy, and to walk with him is to experience him in those spaces. But weddings in this context are not just places of joy and delight, but they're also spaces of disorientation. They're spaces where we find ourselves at our very end. Our efforts come woefully inadequate. The jars were empty. Our efforts to cleanse and rid ourselves of shame come up so empty. What's your wedding? It's not only the joy that perhaps you're experiencing disconnected from Jesus, but it's also your best efforts coming up short, and you are desperately in need of the power of God to meet you. What's your wedding? Let's take it a step further. What's your temple? If you want to encounter this Jesus who's the life of the party, we have to experience him in the temple of our life. Where are the places where, if we're honest, we discover ingrained patterns and rhythms of life that really are dehumanizing to ourselves and others? Patterns that don't glorify God, systems that we've just accepted, a way of life that we don't even question, but if we question it, we know this isn't right, this needs to change. What are the areas in your life that are keeping you from fully flourishing? What are the areas that Jesus, if you give him access to, he'll put his hands and he'll begin to turn them upside down and drive them out of our lives? Whether that's unhealthy relationships, patterns, addictions, rhythms, what are the things that you and I need Jesus to radically transform? I want to invite us as we close, as we enter into a brief moment of prayer. This week, as you reflect and you walk with Jesus and you ask yourself the question, how do I meet Jesus in both the wedding moments of life and the temple spaces of life? Be aware, be attentive to the presence of God in these multifaceted ways. As we close, I want to invite us to open up our hearts as we turn to Jesus and ask him to help us to know him who is the life of the party, but who also is the cleanser of the temple. Jesus, I pray for my wonderful friends at High Rock. I ask that they would meet you as both the deliverer of shame and also the one who disciplines our life from error. Lord, would we not meet you in one space and not the other, but may we encounter you, Lord, in this moment where we're being surprised by you, shocked by things that we didn't know about you. May we fully enter into all you're inviting us into. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you, High Rock. Pray you have an incredible week and that you would fully encounter Jesus in all the ways he's coming to you.